I had always thought $500 wasn't much, until today. Until that mere amount became the trigger for me to finally leave the place I had called home for 13 years. It wasn't about the money itself, but the constant belittling and lack of respect that came along with it. A few hours ago, my mother-in-law, with her usual disdain, snapped, "If you can't even pay $500 for rent, then leave." Those words echoed in my head as I quietly stood up, walked to my room, and began packing. My name is Gina Manning, and at 42, I'm a freelance designer who has spent the last 13 years living with my in-laws, while my husband, Robert, worked abroad. We have a 13-year-old son named Justin, who is the reason I've tolerated all of this for so long. I wanted to keep our family together, even if it meant enduring constant criticism from Robert's parents and his sister Sarah. But today, I realized I had had enough. The argument started when I suggested that Sarah, who only worked part-time, could help with the rent. Justin had just entered middle school, and our expenses were increasing. But instead of understanding, my mother-in-law threw my suggestion back in my face. "If you don't want to pay, you can leave," she sneered, as if my work as a designer, something she dismissed as playing around on the computer, was worthless. I had been planning this moment for years. I didn't argue with her. I simply walked to my room, grabbed the suitcase I had kept ready, and packed the few belongings I had left after years of slowly reducing my possessions. I was done. The situation hadn't always been this bad. When Robert and I first got married, life seemed full of possibilities. We were in our late 20s, and though we weren't rich, we were happy. I worked from home as a designer, and Robert had a good job with a global construction company. But things took a turn when Robert's father fell ill. His health deteriorated quickly, and Robert's family needed help. "We need to move in with my parents," Robert had said one night, his voice filled with worry. "I can't handle this on my own." I agreed because I loved Robert, and I wanted to help. Besides, I had lost my own parents when I was younger, and I understood the importance of family. We moved in with his parents, thinking it would only be for a short time, just until his father's health improved. But as his father's condition worsened, it became clear that this arrangement wasn't temporary. At first, I tried to make the best of it. I took on more household responsibilities while continuing my design work. But the longer we stayed, the more my mother-in-law and sister-in-law began to take advantage of me. They treated me like a live-in maid, assigning me all the household chores while they contributed nothing. My father-in-law, bedridden and angry at the world, would yell at me to bring him beer, even though his doctors had forbidden alcohol. My mother-in-law, who had seemed so kind when we first moved in, revealed her true nature, constantly belittling me, calling me lazy for working from home. Then there was Sarah. She worked a few hours a week at a part-time job, but acted as though she was carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. She never contributed to the household expenses and would criticize everything I did. When I cooked, she'd complain the food was bland. When I ironed, she'd find a wrinkle I missed and berate me for it. I tried to keep my head down, telling myself that things would improve, but deep down, I knew they wouldn't. Robert, meanwhile, was often away on long business trips overseas. His company was involved in international construction projects, and I had known from the start that his job would require travel. What I hadn't anticipated was how alone I would feel. Robert was my anchor, and without him around, I felt adrift in a sea of hostility. Every time he came home, I wanted to tell him how bad things had gotten, but I didn't want to worry him. He had enough on his plate, and I didn't want to burden him with my problems. But after months of enduring the relentless mistreatment from his family, I couldn't take it anymore. I called Robert one night, my voice trembling as I told him everything. "I can't do this, Robert. Your mother, Sarah, they treat me like I'm nothing." Robert was shocked. "I didn't know things were this bad," he said, guilt lacing his voice. "I'll talk to them. I'll fix this." And he tried. He called his mother and asked her to ease up on me, but his intervention only made things worse. My mother-in-law was furious that I had complained to Robert. "You're making us look like the bad guys," she had said, her voice dripping with resentment. From that point on, the hostility only escalated. They criticized everything I did. No matter how hard I worked, it was never good enough. I began to feel like a prisoner in their home, trapped in a toxic environment where nothing I did was ever appreciated. But I stayed, for Justin, for Robert. I told myself that once Robert's assignment overseas ended, things would get better. He would come home, and we could leave. But the longer I waited, the more I realized that nothing would change unless I made it happen. Then came the argument about the rent. It was a small thing, really, $500, but it represented so much more than that. It was about respect, or the lack of it. After everything I had done for them, caring for their house, paying for the utilities, raising Justin, they still treated me like I was worthless. That day, something in me snapped. As I packed my things, Sarah appeared in the doorway. "If you're so smart, why don't you just stop paying for everything?" she sneered. I looked at her, a smile forming on my lips. "I think I will," I said quietly. And with that, I walked out of the house. I had planned for this moment for years. I knew that one day I would reach my breaking point, so I had made sure to be ready. I had saved up money, found a short-term apartment, and even arranged for Justin to stay with me without disrupting his school routine. The minute I stepped out of that house, I felt lighter. I wasn't leaving behind a home. I was escaping a prison. I called Justin and explained the situation. He was worried, but he understood. We had talked about this day before, and I had prepared him for the possibility that we might need to leave suddenly. "I'll meet you at the apartment after school," I told him. After settling into the apartment, I made a series of phone calls. Since all the utility bills were in my name, I canceled them one by one. Electricity, water, gas. I knew my in-laws had no idea that I had been the one paying for everything. They believed Robert was still covering all the household expenses from abroad. They were in for a rude awakening. The next morning, my phone rang. It was my mother-in-law, and she was livid. "The electricity and water have been cut off. What did you do?" she screamed, her voice shrill with panic. "I did exactly what you told me to do," I replied calmly. "I stopped paying." There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. I could almost see the realization dawning on her. For years, she had treated me like a burden, assuming I was living off Robert's income. But now she was faced with the truth. I had been the one keeping the household running. Without me, they had nothing. A few hours later, my father-in-law called. His voice was shaky, and I could tell he was trying to keep his anger in check. "Gina, the real estate agent, called. We're responsible for the rent now? What's going on?" I smiled as I listened to his confusion. "Yes, you're responsible for the rent now, just like I was for the past several years," I replied, keeping my tone even. They had always believed that Robert was paying for everything, that I was just a freeloader with no real job. But now, they were finally seeing the truth. I had been paying for everything: rent, utilities, groceries, and they had been living comfortably on my dime. Later that day, my mother-in-law called again. This time, her tone was different. Less angry, more pleading. "Gina, we didn't realize. We thought Robert was paying for everything. You've been paying the bills?" "Yes," I said, my voice steady. "For years, and my income isn't just some hobby. I make over $100,000 a year from my freelance design work." There was a long silence. I could hear her struggling to process what I had just told her. She had always dismissed my work as insignificant, but now, faced with the truth, she had nothing to say. "I don't believe you," she said weakly, but her voice lacked conviction. "I can prove it," I replied calmly. "Look up my company. You'll see my name." I heard Sarah in the background quickly typing on her phone. A few moments later, she gasped. "She's telling the truth," Sarah whispered, her voice filled with disbelief. For years, they had belittled me, treating me like I was nothing. Now they knew the truth. I had been supporting them all along, and they had never even noticed. I hung up the phone, feeling a sense of closure. I had done what I needed to do. I wasn't going back to that house, and I wasn't going to be part of their lives anymore. Robert, Justin, and I would start fresh, free from the toxic environment that had poisoned us for so long. But the fallout wasn't over yet. My in-laws were panicking. scrambling to figure out how to keep the household running without my financial support. Sarah, who had never contributed a dime to the household, was now being forced to step up. My mother-in-law, who had always treated me like a burden, was now realizing just how much I had done for them. A week later, Robert returned home. He had heard about what had happened and was furious with his family. "I had no idea it had gotten this bad," he said, his voice filled with regret. "I should have done more." "It's not your fault," I reassured him. "I didn't tell you everything because I didn't want to burden you, but now it's over. We're starting a new life." And so we did. We moved into a new home, far away from the toxic influence of Robert's family. For the first time in years, I felt free to live my life on my own terms, without the constant judgment and criticism of people who never appreciated me. Our new home was a small apartment in a quiet neighborhood, but it was ours. Justin adjusted quickly to the new routine, and Robert, no longer tied to his overseas assignments, began working on projects closer to home. We were finally able to build the family life we had always wanted, without the shadow of his parents looming over us. As for my in-laws, they were left to deal with the consequences of their actions. Sarah, who had never learned how to manage her own finances, quickly found herself in debt. My mother-in-law, who had always taken comfort in the idea that Robert and I would support her, was now struggling to make ends meet. I didn't feel sorry for them. They had made their choices, and now they had to live with them. But for us, life was finally looking up. Looking back on everything that had happened, I realized that I had spent far too long trying to please people who would never appreciate me. I had allowed myself to be trapped in a toxic environment because I believed that family came first, no matter what. But sometimes, the best thing you can do for yourself is to walk away. I had no regrets about leaving. I had built a new life for myself, one where I was in control. Robert and I were closer than ever, and Justin was thriving in school. For the first time in years, I felt truly happy. And as for my in-laws, they were no longer my concern. In the end, I learned that sometimes you have to stand up for yourself, even if it means leaving behind the people who are supposed to care for you. My in-laws had taken advantage of me for years, but I had finally taken back control of my life. It wasn't easy, but it was worth it. Now I'm free to live my life the way I want to,